Hi, and thank you for visiting my channel. For more information, kindly subscribe and follow. Now let's get started.
Roman Reigns issued a warning to his former wiseman, Paul Heyman, ahead of tonight's episode of WWE Raw. The Hall of Famer recently shared a social media update to reveal he was aware of the threat sent by the OTC. After taking out Braun Breaker and Bronson Reed on his return to television programming last week, the former undisputed WWE Universal Champion is all set to show up on Raw tonight, and seemingly set up a SummerSlam program. Heading into the show, Reigns took to social media to call out his former wiseman for a face-off later tonight on the Red brand. The Oracle took to his Instagram stories to share the threat posed by Roman Reigns, establishing that he was well aware of the 40-year-old's message and he was not intimidated at all. WWE Hall of Famer Paul Heyman makes interesting claim about one of his stablemates. Paul Heyman hailed former NXT North American champion Big Bronson Reed during a recent interview with Shaq Wrestling. He referred to the Oscilla as the most underappreciated and underutilized monster the promotion has had for some time. He further explained how Reed's addition to their faction, in turn, also benefited the 36-year-old. Bronson Reed is the most underappreciated and underutilized monster that we've had, for years. And now, finally, he gets the spotlight to enjoy. And he not only gets the spotlight, but now he gets the right opponents to smash. Now he gets the right opponents to tsunami. Before, it was an effort to get Bronson Reed into a main event. Now the main eventers line up for him, Heyman said. In the absence of Seth Rollins, the onus will be on the Oracle to guide Bronson Reed and Braun Breaker to bigger heights. It was one of those nights when the energy backstage at WWE SmackDown felt heavier than usual, like a storm about to break. Under the glaring lights, production crew hurried about, superstars paced their locker rooms, and somewhere, Roman Reigns' presence loomed like a shadow nobody could quite shake. But in the corner of all this stood the man who might understand that shadow better than anyone else alive, Paul Heyman. Heyman had been pacing himself. He wasn't a man easily rattled. Decades in this business had taught him to move chess pieces so subtly that even the board didn't realize it was shifting. Yet tonight, his mind refused to settle. Roman Reigns, the tribal chief, was not a chess piece. He was the board. And lately, the board was showing cracks. Earlier that night, rumors had swirled. Rumors about Roman's next move. About the lingering resentment in his bloodline. About the whispers that even Solo Sikoa, the enforcer, was beginning to listen to voices that didn't start and end with Roman. And Paul Heyman, wise, weary, calculating, knew all too well what that meant. Heyman stood in a narrow hallway, arms folded over his chest, watching the monitor that displayed the live show feed. The Usos had just laid down another challenge, one that Roman would have to answer. But it wasn't the Usos that worried him. It was Roman's silence. When Reigns went silent, people tended to disappear, sometimes metaphorically, sometimes literally. A low voice interrupted his thoughts. "You look troubled, wise man." Heyman didn't have to turn to know who it was. Jey Uso, in street clothes, smirked as he leaned against the opposite wall. His grin was laced with the kind of confidence only a man with nothing left to lose could wear. "Jey," Heyman said softly, adjusting his tie. "You should be careful where you appear. Roman doesn't like ghosts." Jey laughed, the sound sharp. "I'm no ghost, Paul. I'm the Reckoning. And you know it." Heyman's eyes narrowed. He wanted to argue, to dismiss him like old times. But he couldn't. Because deep down, he knew the Reckoning was here. He had seen it in Roman's eyes last week, when the tribal chief sat in the locker room, not surrounded by Golden brothers, but alone, stripped of the invincibility he'd cloaked himself in for years. "You think I don't know?" Heyman whispered, stepping closer so the cameras wouldn't catch this moment. "You think I don't know what happens when Roman feels cornered? I know better than anyone." "You gonna do anything about it?" Jey asked, his tone edged with mockery but hiding real curiosity. Heyman didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was an answer in itself, one Jey understood. He pushed off the wall and gave Heyman a look of something like pity. "Good luck, wise man. You're gonna need it." When Jey vanished down the hall, Heyman let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned back to the monitor just in time to see Roman's entrance music hit. The crowd erupted. The arena darkened except for the blinding white spotlight that followed the tribal chief to the ring. Heyman's eyes flickered. Roman looked magnificent, still every bit the head of the table. But to Heyman's seasoned eyes, there were fissures behind the glare of his gold and the weight of his titles. Fissures Heyman knew all too well. Because what Reigns saw as threats, Heyman saw as inevitabilities. He made his way to gorilla position, the final stop before stepping out through the curtain. There, Roman stood, cloaked in his Samoan lei, the Universal Championship draped over his shoulder like a reminder to the world, and to himself, that he still ruled this empire. "Wise man," Roman said, without looking at him. "Yes, my tribal chief." Heyman forced a smile. A mask. He'd worn many over the years, but this one had begun to slip. The weight of what he knew was pulling it down. "You talked to Jay?" Roman's voice was low, but sharp as a blade. Heyman flinched inwardly. Briefly. He wanted to. Roman turned, cutting him off with a glare that froze Heyman's excuses mid-breath. "He wants my head, Paul. He wants this entire empire. You know that, don't you?" Heyman nodded slowly. "I do, my tribal chief." "And you know what happens to people who want what's mine?" Heyman's throat went dry. He knew. He had seen Roman bury family before, brothers, cousins, friends. But he also knew this wasn't the same Roman. The cracks had widened. His power, while still terrifying, was no longer unquestioned. "I know," Heyman said, his voice barely above a whisper. Roman stepped closer. The crowd's roar filtered through the curtain, echoing like thunder behind him. "Then act like it. Remind them who I am." Paul Heyman met Roman's eyes. For a split second, he saw not the tribal chief, but the man beneath. The man terrified of losing the table he built. And for the first time in years, Heyman realized that maybe, just maybe, his power was bigger than Roman's threat. Because knowledge is power. And the wise man knew everything. When the music swelled and Roman stepped through the curtain, Heyman stayed back for a heartbeat, staring into the empty gorilla position. His mind spun like a roulette wheel. He'd survived Brock Lesnar's wrath, CM Punk's betrayal, ECW's collapse, and decades of locker room politics. But surviving Roman Reigns would require something more. He straightened his tie again, the gesture calming his trembling hands. If Roman Reigns was a threat, then Paul Heyman was the insurance policy the threat never saw coming. He was the voice in the shadows. The whisper that decided who rose and who fell. And as the tribal chief raised his title high under the blinding lights, Heyman turned and walked back into the shadows, where he did his best work. If Roman Reigns was the head of the table, then Paul Heyman was the architect of the whole damn dining hall. And tonight, he reminded himself of that. Because the wise man knew that when the table inevitably broke, he'd be the one still standing, ready to build another. Or to crown whoever dared to sit at its head next. And as the fans chanted Roman's name in unison, Paul Heyman's whisper echoed in the back of his own mind, "Yes, my tribal chief." But for how long?